Historically, the most important exponent of the teaching on emptiness in Madhyamaka has been second century master Nagarjuna, whose influential treatises has really paved the way for a systematic understanding of the Buddha's teaching on emptiness, the middle way. Of course, Nagarjuna was followed by many other great masters like Aryadeva, his immediate disciple, Buddha Palita in the 5th century, and then Bhaviveka in the 6th century, and Chandrakirti in the 7th century. And in the Tibetan tradition, perhaps one of the most well-known exponent of Madhyamaka philosophy is Tsongkhapa. So these are the great masters whose teaching and writing and kind of instructions on meditation really inform and shape His Holiness the Dalai Lama's own understanding of wisdom within the context of Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism. So I think this is really important. So in a nutshell, what is emptiness? Because Madhyamaka philosophy's central message, central teaching is the teaching on emptiness. And so, in other words, why emptiness matters? The emptiness matters because at the heart of the highest wisdom, as understood by Mahayana Buddhism, is this truth of emptiness. And one could say that if wisdom is the highest level of realization that opened the door to liberation, emptiness is the content of that wisdom. So wisdom is the manifestation of the truth of that emptiness. So, but then what is that emptiness? So emptiness is really, in a nutshell, emptiness represents the ultimate nature of reality as possible as it can be conceived and understood by the human mind. So at the heart of the teaching on emptiness, there is the recognition that nothing exists in the entire universe that has somehow independent objective existence. In our naive perception of the world, we tend to look at things as billiard balls coming into contact with each other. Somehow each of the things that we perceive has kind of integral, self-enclosed reality that are describable and definable in our language and concept. What Nagarjuna's philosophy of emptiness is suggesting to us is that this is a very naive, everyday conception of reality, but that is not in tune with what the actual reality itself. The actual reality is deeply interconnected. One thing presupposes the other. So even for example, the concept of fire presupposes fuel, presupposes the capacity to burn, ashes. So we may think fire as somehow independent, existing on its own right, but if we dig deeper, the very notion of fire is embedded within the large context of many other things, without which even the concept of fire would not make sense. So Nagarjuna's philosophy of emptiness is pointing us to go beyond the surface level of our everyday perception, where we tend to lock onto things as really out there, objectively definable with self-enclosed boundaries. And why need to go beyond this? Because if you dig deeper, there's a psychological dimension to this teaching on emptiness. A large part of our strong negative emotional reactions tend to latch on to this assumption of lumped together discrete realities that are definable in some terms. So in other words, we objectify things, we reify them, we make them real, we invest so much reality in them, and then based upon that assumption, we then react naturally, strongly, like us and them. It's mine, it's theirs, so all of this grasping, emotional reactivity is based upon grasping. Grasping presupposes objective intrinsic reality that are self-definable. So Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness is directly tied to a deep insight into the psychology of our emotions, and particularly the negative emotions that tend to objectify and divide and reify things. So the teaching on emptiness is pointing out that the large part of the world that we perceive is actually our own fantasy, our own creation, our own construction. And if we are able to, even if we are able to strip away the top layers, our tendency to grasp will be relaxed, a bit more relaxed. So one way of looking at the importance of teaching on emptiness is to really show us a liberating way in which we can rid ourselves of our strong impulse and desire to reify, grasp, and cling. And so this clinging and grasping is at the root of many of our problems. And large part of that is the clinging to self, based upon an assumption of there being a true me. Somehow deep down, there is a real me that is an ego describable, discrete self. And Buddhist teaching, right from the early teachings of the Buddha, reminds us that this self, as we imagine, is a fiction. And for whose sake we expend so much energy trying to protect it, trying to fight against the perceived threat for it, based upon which we then make differentiations of self and others. We then create enemies and friends. All of this division and discrimination is built upon this fragile ego, fragile notion of a self. So Buddha's teaching right from the beginning on no self opened the way for the higher levels of teachings on emptiness, which then in the Mahayana Sutras were presented and Nagarjuna fleshed them out.